The morning of June 9th, 1944, Norrey-en-Bessin, Normandy. Sergeant G.K. Henry peered through the narrow gunner's sight of his Sherman Firefly, watching German Panthers roll toward his position with the arrogance of invincibility. To the crews of the 12th SS Panzer Division, these British Shermans were targets, not threats. The Panther's 80mm sloped frontal armour had proven immune to every Allied tank gun encountered thus far. But as the first Panther centred in Henry's crosshairs at roughly 800 yards, he gave an order that would shatter German confidence. Load 17-pounder. The massive shell slammed into the breech. Henry fired. The tungsten cord projectile screamed across the Norman countryside at over 2,900 feet per second. It struck the lead Panther's turret and punched straight through with a shower of molten metal. The supposedly impenetrable German tank erupted in flames. Before the surviving Panthers could process what had happened, Henry's Firefly traversed smoothly. Another shot, another penetration, another flaming wreck. In rapid succession, 5 Panthers fell to this single British tank, their crews bailing out in shock and terror. 2 more Panthers were destroyed by other Shermans in Henry's troop. Out of 12 attacking German tanks, 7 burned on the Norman soil. The German crews radioed back in confusion. Something was wrong. The Shermans were killing Panthers frontally at ranges where that should have been impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened at Nori-en-Bessin, you must first understand the crisis British armour faced in 1944. The Sherman tank, in its standard configuration with the 75mm M3 gun, was adequate against Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. It was faster, more reliable, and featured gun stabilization that allowed firing while moving. But against the new generation of German armour, the standard Sherman was desperately outmatched. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943 after German encounters with Soviet T-34s, represented a revolutionary leap in armoured design. Its frontal armour wasn't merely thick, it was angled at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of approximately 140mm against projectiles striking head-on. Combined with the powerful long-barreled 75mm KK-42 gun, the Panther could destroy Allied tanks from distances where Allied guns simply bounced off its armour. British tank crews in North Africa and Italy had learned bitter lessons about German armour superiority. The Churchill tank, despite its thick armour, mounted guns inadequate for modern tank combat. The Cromwell cruiser tank, fast and manoeuvrable, carried the Ordnance QF 75mm gun, essentially a British version of the Sherman's gun with similar ballistic performance. Against Panthers and Tigers, these weapons were nearly useless at combat ranges. The Tiger tank was even worse. With frontal armour 100mm thick and vertical rather than sloped, it still proved nearly impervious to Allied tank guns. The Tiger's 88mm K-36 gun, derived from the famous Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun, could destroy any Allied tank from beyond 2,000 yards. British crews watched helplessly as Tigers engaged them from ranges where return fire was pointless. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A standard Sherman 75mm gun-firing M61 armour-piercing rounds could penetrate approximately 60mm of armour at 1,000 yards. Against a Panther's effective frontal armour of 140mm, this was utterly inadequate. Crews had to manoeuvre for flank shots, exposing themselves to devastating German fire. The loss ratios reflected this imbalance savagely. But Britain possessed a weapon that could change everything. The Ordnance QF 17-pounder anti-tank gun, developed beginning in 1942 as intelligence revealed German armour was growing thicker and more sophisticated, was one of the most powerful anti-tank weapons of the war. In its towed configuration, the 17-pounder had proven devastatingly effective against German heavy armour. The gun fired a 17-pound projectile, hence its name, at velocities approaching 2,900 feet per second, with standard armour-piercing ballistic capped ammunition. British testing showed the 17-pounder could penetrate 168mm of armour at 500 metres, 149mm at 1,000 metres, and 132mm at 1,500 metres. This meant the 17-pounder could defeat Panther frontal armour at combat ranges where the Panther's crew thought they were invulnerable. Against the Tiger's 100mm frontal armour, the 17-pounder was even more effective. British firing trials conducted against captured Tigers demonstrated that 17-pounder armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the Tiger's frontal hull at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The gun mantlet, the Tiger's thickest armor at up to 120 millimeters in some areas, could still be penetrated from 2,500 yards at favorable angles. The 17-pounder also possessed a secret weapon that elevated it above every other anti-tank gun in the Western Allies' arsenal. Armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, known as APDS, used a tungsten carbide sub-caliber penetrator, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. The tungsten core, being far denser and harder than steel, achieved muzzle velocities of nearly 3,500 feet per second. With APDS ammunition, the 17-pounder could penetrate 256 millimeters of armor at 500 meters and 233 millimeters at 1,000 meters. This performance exceeded even the German 88mm Quag K43L71 gun mounted on the Tiger II. In theory, the 17-pounder with APDS could penetrate the frontal armor of every German tank in service, even the massive King Tiger, at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. But there was a critical problem. The 17-pounder was a towed gun. It weighed nearly 3,000 pounds in action, required a crew of 7 men, and needed to be positioned and dug in before combat. In the fluid, fast-moving battles of 1944, towed anti-tank guns were vulnerable. They couldn't maneuver quickly, couldn't retreat under fire, and were priority targets for German artillery and tanks. British planners understood that the 17-pounder needed to be mounted in a tank. The question was, which tank? Britain's own tank development programs in 1943 and early 1944 were experiencing severe difficulties. The A-30 Challenger tank, specifically designed to mount the 17-pounder, had been delayed by mechanical problems and production challenges. The Cromwell tank, Britain's fast cruiser tank, had insufficient turret ring diameter to accommodate the 17-pounder's massive breech and recoil system. This left only one option. The American M4 Sherman, supplied to Britain in massive quantities through Lend-Lease, had one critical advantage over British tank designs. The Sherman possessed a turret ring 69 inches in diameter, larger than the Panther's 65-inch ring despite the Sherman being a smaller tank overall. This spacious turret design meant the Sherman might, just possibly, be able to accommodate the 17-pounder gun. The idea of mounting the 17-pounder in the Sherman had been proposed as early as January 1943 by Major George Brighty of the Royal Tank Regiment and G.K. Kilbourne, a Vickers engineer working for the Department of Tank Design. Both men recognized that Britain needed a stopgap solution until purpose-built British tanks could enter service. But the proposal initially met resistance from the Ministry of Supply, which considered the project impractical. The challenges were immense and immediately obvious. The 17-pounder gun, in its standard configuration for towed use, had a recoil stroke of 40 inches. The Sherman's turret simply didn't have 40 inches of space behind the breech for the gun to recoil backward. The gun would smash into the back of the turret, potentially killing the crew and certainly destroying the tank's combat effectiveness. Kilbourne solved this seemingly insurmountable problem through brilliant engineering redesign. Rather than modifying the existing recoil system, he completely reimagined it. The standard vertical recoil cylinders were replaced with shorter horizontal cylinders mounted on both sides of the gun, taking advantage of the turret's width rather than its depth. This innovative side-mounted design reduced the recoil stroke to a manageable distance, but redesigning the recoil system created another problem. The 17-pounder's breech block moved vertically, sliding downward to open for loading. Inside the confines of a Sherman turret, this vertical movement would make loading nearly impossible for the gunner, who would have to reach above his head to insert shells, while the tank was potentially under fire and maneuvering violently. Kilbourne solved this by rotating the entire breech 90 degrees, allowing the breech block to slide horizontally to the left rather than vertically downward. This meant the loader, stationed on the left side of the gun, could load from a comfortable position even during combat. The modification required a completely new breech. A design designated the Mark IV 17-pounder specifically for the Firefly variant. The next challenge involved the radio. In British tanks, the radio was traditionally mounted in the rear of the turret, behind the gun breech. With the massive 17-pounder now occupying that space, the radio had nowhere to go. Kilbourne's solution was to weld an armoured box onto the back of the turret exterior. This bustle, as it was called, housed the radio equipment and also served as a counterweight for the long gun barrel projecting forward. The turret modifications solved the mechanical problems, but created human ones. With the massive gun breech filling the turret interior, the loader found it nearly impossible to exit quickly through the commander's hatch if the tank was hit. In combat, those extra seconds could mean the difference between life and burning to death. The solution was to cut an additional hatch into the top of the turret directly over the gunner's position, providing a second emergency escape route. The final major modification involved ammunition storage. The 17-pounder rounds were significantly longer than standard 75mm shells, measuring approximately 36 inches compared to 24 inches for 75mm ammunition. To create sufficient space for 17-pounder ammunition in the hull, the assistant driver position was eliminated entirely. The bow machine gun was removed, and the forward hull space was converted into ammunition bins. This reduced the crew from 5 men to 4. With all these modifications completed, the Sherman Firefly could carry 77 rounds of 17-pounder ammunition, though only about 23 rounds were readily accessible during combat. The rest had to be retrieved from awkward storage locations, slowing the rate of fire during sustained engagements. But 77 rounds was deemed sufficient for the tank's intended role as a mobile tank destroyer, supporting standard Shermans. The prototype conversion was completed in November 1943. Initial testing revealed the design worked, though crews would need to adapt to the Firefly's unique characteristics. The massive muzzle blast from the 17-pounder kicked up enormous amounts of dust and smoke, making it difficult for the gunner to observe shot placement. The brilliant muzzle flash could blind crew members who didn't blink at the exact moment of firing, and the tremendous recoil was jarring even with the redesigned recoil system. By October and November 1943, enthusiasm for the Firefly project began growing rapidly within British military circles. The 21st Army Group, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery and designated for the Normandy invasion, was informed of the new tank in October. Intelligence was beginning to reveal that German production of Panthers was far higher than previously estimated. The Panther was not a rare heavy tank, like the Tiger. It was becoming Germany's standard medium tank. Even before final testing was completed in February 1944, an order for 2,100 Sherman tanks armed with the 17-pounder gun was placed. The Challenger program was suffering constant delays, and intelligence now confirmed that the Cromwell's turret ring was too small to mount even the new high-velocity 75mm gun intended for it. The Firefly had transitioned from stopgap measure to critical necessity. Production began in January 1944 at 4 dedicated conversion facilities, 2 in London, 1 in Manchester, and 1 in Nottingham. Not every Sherman model could be converted. Only petrol-engine Shermans with the M34A1 gun mount and hydraulic turret traverse systems were eligible. This included Sherman Is, which were M4S with welded hulls, Sherman I hybrids with composite hulls, and Sherman Verses, which were M4A4S with the Chrysler multibank engine. The vast majority of Fireflies were converted from Sherman Vs because Britain had received approximately 7,200 of this model through Lend-Lease, far more than any other variant. The M4, a Fors Chrysler, a 57 multibank engine, an unusual design combining 5 automobile engines into a single power plant, was considered less desirable by American forces, who preferred the radial or Ford 5.8 engines. But for British purposes, it functioned adequately and provided a plentiful supply of hulls for conversion. Tanks armed with the 17-pounder were designated with a C in their mark number, leading to designations like Sherman IC for a converted M4, Sherman IC Hybrid for a converted composite hull M4, and Sherman VC for a converted M4A4. The nickname Firefly was adopted by troops due to the brilliant muzzle flash of the main gun, visible even in daylight and absolutely dazzling at night. Official documents sometimes referred to them as Mayflies, but Firefly became the universal nickname. Production proceeded at maximum pace through the spring of 1944. By May 31, 1944, 342 Sherman Fireflies had been delivered to the 21st Army Group for the D-Day landings just 1 week away. It was a remarkable achievement. In barely 5 months, Britain had conceived, designed, tested, and produced hundreds of the most powerful Allied tank in Europe, ready for combat on the most important day of the war. The allocation scheme was carefully planned. British tank troops, equivalent to American platoons, consisted of 4 tanks. In Firefly-equipped units, One Firefly would be assigned to each troop, with the other 3 tanks being standard Shermans with 75mm guns. This distribution provided specialized anti-tank capability while maintaining numerical strength and the versatility of high-explosive firepower from the 75mm guns. The same distribution occurred in Cromwell units, though this created logistical complications since each Cromwell troop now needed spare parts for 2 entirely different tank models. The Firefly was also slower than the fast Cromwell, potentially creating tactical problems during rapid advances. Churchill units received no Fireflies at all and had to rely on attached M10 or M10 Achilles tank destroyers for anti-tank support. Training for Firefly crews was minimal, almost dangerously so. Most regiments received their Fireflies only in late May 1944, barely 2 weeks before D-Day. Crews had to learn the new vehicle's characteristics, peculiarities, and combat employment through brief field exercises. Gunnery training was particularly limited. Some Firefly gunners, like Joe Eakins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, would later recall firing as few as 5 practice rounds before their first combat engagement. But necessity outweighed ideal preparation. The Fireflies had to be ready for D-Day, and Canadian forces would face the bulk of German armour in Normandy, including the concentration of SS Panzer divisions around Caen. Intelligence estimates suggested German forces would deploy hundreds of Panthers and dozens of Tigers to contain the Allied beachhead. Without the Firefly, British armour would be facing German heavy tanks with weapons that couldn't reliably penetrate their frontal armour at combat ranges. The first combat action involving a Firefly occurred not on land but at sea during the D-Day invasion itself. Fireflies were mounted on specialized landing craft and used as floating gun platforms to suppress German coastal defenses during the initial assault waves. But it was on land, in the brutal hedgerow fighting of Normandy, where the Firefly would prove its true worth. June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy commenced with the largest amphibious operation in human history. Over 150,000 troops crossed the English Channel, under massive naval and air support. British and Canadian forces landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches on the eastern flank of the invasion front, tasked with capturing the critical city of Caen and the high ground beyond. Within hours, it became clear that German resistance was far stronger than pre-invasion estimates suggested. The 12 SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed of fanatically motivated young soldiers and equipped with modern Panthers and Panzer IVs, moved rapidly to contain the British advance. The 21st Panzer Division, though equipped with older tanks, deployed with skill and determination. The battle for Normandy was beginning. On June 9th, just 3 days after D-Day, the Sherman Firefly faced its first major test at Norrey-en-Bessin. The 12th SS Panzer Division launched a counterattack with 12 Panther tanks against positions held by the Canadian Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by British armour, including several Fireflies of the Elgin Regiment. The German plan was straightforward: use the Panthers' superior armour and firepower to destroy the Allied positions and drive them back toward the coast. But Sergeant G.K, Henry and his Firefly crew had other plans. Positioned in a hull-down position that concealed most of the tank's hull while exposing only the turret, Henry waited until the Panthers were at approximately 800 yards before opening fire. His first shot struck a Panther in the turret, penetrating the armour and igniting the ammunition inside. The Panther exploded catastrophically, its turret blown off by the force of the detonation. The remaining Panthers continued advancing, but Henry's gun crew worked with practiced efficiency. Load, aim, fire. Another Panther stopped, smoke pouring from its hatches as the crew bailed out. The 17-pounder's penetration was so complete that German crews, accustomed to Allied rounds bouncing off harmlessly, were utterly shocked to find themselves burning inside supposedly invulnerable tanks. In rapid succession, 5 Panthers fell to Henry's Firefly alone, an almost unprecedented feat of gunnery. 2 more Panthers were destroyed by other Shermans in the engagement. Out of 12 German tanks committed to the attack, 7 burned on the field, and the remaining 5 withdrew in confusion. The counterattack had failed completely. The Firefly had announced its presence on the battlefield with devastating effectiveness. But more importantly, the engagement revealed something profound about what the Firefly represented. This wasn't just a tank with a bigger gun. It was the materialization of British industrial determination, engineering ingenuity, and tactical necessity combined into steel and explosives. The Germans had built the Panther to be invulnerable. They had created doctrine around that invulnerability, and in 12 devastating minutes, that doctrine was shattered. German intelligence officers struggled to understand what had happened at Concede, Norrey-en-Bessin. Field reports described Allied tanks penetrating Panther armor from frontal aspects at medium ranges. This contradicted everything German armor doctrine assumed about Allied tank capabilities. Initial theories ranged from new American tank models to experimental British weapons. The truth, when it finally became clear, was more troubling than German commanders imagined. The Firefly's 17-pounder gun wasn't just powerful, it represented a fundamental shift in the armoured warfare equation. For the first time since the introduction of the Panther and Tiger, Allied tanks could engage German heavy armour on roughly equal terms, at least in firepower, if not protection. But the full implications of this shift would only become apparent as more Fireflies entered combat throughout June and July 1944. To understand why the Firefly became so feared by German tank crews, you must examine the specific characteristics that made it unique among Allied tanks. The 17-pounder gun-firing standard armor-piercing ballistic-capped ammunition, designated APC-BC, achieved muzzle velocities of approximately 2,900 feet per second. The projectile itself weighed 17 pounds, considerably heavier than the American 76mm rounds 15 pounds, or the standard Sherman 75mm rounds 14.5 pounds. The combination of high velocity and substantial projectile mass created devastating kinetic energy at impact. British penetration tables, compiled from extensive firing trials against captured German armour, showed the 17-pounder APC-BC could penetrate 168mm of armour at 500 metres. Against the Panther's turret front, which ranged from 100 to 110mm thick depending on location, this meant reliable penetration at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. The Panther's gun mantlet, the rounded casting protecting the gun, mounting, was thicker than the turret face at roughly 100mm, but its curved shape made it vulnerable to penetration. British testing demonstrated that 17-pounder APC-BC rounds could penetrate the Panther mantlet from 2,500 yards at favourable angles, or from 1,000 yards at angles up to 37 degrees from perpendicular. For German crews accustomed to frontal invulnerability, this was psychologically devastating. Against the Tiger, the 17-pounder was even more effective. The Tiger's 100mm vertical frontal armour, though thick, lacked the Panther's sloped design. British firing trials against captured Tigers showed that 17-pounder APC-BC rounds could penetrate the Tiger's frontal hull at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards and the gun mantlet at ranges approaching 2,000 yards. The Tiger's side armour, 80mm thick and vertical, could be penetrated from well over 2,000 yards. But the 17-pounder possessed an even more devastating capability. Armour-piercing, discarding sabot ammunition, though produced in limited quantities and not available on D-Day itself, began reaching Firefly units in increasing numbers by late June and early July 1944. APDS rounds used a tungsten carbide penetrator weighing 7.7 pounds, wrapped in an aluminum sabot that separated after leaving the barrel. The tungsten core achieved muzzle velocities approaching 3,500 feet per second, significantly faster than conventional ammunition. At these velocities, the APDS round could penetrate 256mm of armour at 500 metres and 233mm at 1,000 metres. This performance meant the Firefly with APDS could theoretically penetrate even the King Tiger's frontal armour, the thickest on any operational tank in 1944. However, APDS ammunition had significant drawbacks that limited its tactical effectiveness. The high-velocity tungsten penetrator was extremely sensitive to barrel wear and muzzle brake design. The sabot separation after leaving the barrel had to be clean and symmetrical, or the penetrator would tumble in flight, destroying accuracy. British testing found that APDS accuracy degraded dramatically beyond 500 yards, with hit rates falling to unacceptable levels at 1,000 yards. Additionally, the small tungsten penetrator created only a narrow wound channel when it penetrated armour. Unlike the larger APC-BC projectile, which created extensive spalling and damage inside the target, the APDS penetrator sometimes passed through without catastrophically destroying the enemy tank. German crews reported instances where APDS rounds penetrated their tanks but caused limited internal damage, allowing the vehicle to remain operational. Most critically, APDS ammunition was scarce. Tungsten supplies were limited globally, and Britain needed tungsten for machine tools, cutting equipment, and other industrial applications as desperately as it needed tungsten for ammunition. Production of APDS rounds never exceeded a small fraction of total 17-pounder ammunition output. Most Firefly crews received only 5 or 6 APDS rounds per tank, if they received any at all. Standing orders required crews to use APDS only against heavy German armour when APCBC rounds proved insufficient. In practice, this meant Firefly crews relied overwhelmingly on standard APCBC ammunition for combat. The APDS rounds were kept as insurance against the thickest German armour, but the reality of Normandy combat demonstrated that APCBC was adequate for most engagements. Panthers could be penetrated frontally at combat ranges with APCBC. Tigers could be defeated at reasonable distances. The psychological security of having APDS available was perhaps more valuable than its actual tactical employment. The Firefly's effectiveness wasn't solely about gun penetration. The Sherman's inherent characteristics contributed significantly to its success as a tank-killing platform. The Sherman featured a gyro-stabilizer for the main gun, a sophisticated system that used gyroscopes to detect and compensate for tank motion. This meant a Firefly could fire accurately while moving, something German tanks generally could not do. In the chaotic, close-range combat of the Norman bocage, firing on the move provided critical advantages. The Sherman's design also emphasized crew ergonomics and visibility. The turret was spacious by wartime standards, allowing the commander, gunner, and loader to work efficiently even during sustained combat. The commander's position featured excellent visibility through periscopes and vision blocks, enabling rapid target acquisition. German tanks, by comparison, often had cramped turrets with limited visibility, forcing commanders to expose themselves through open hatches to fight effectively. The Firefly inherited these Sherman advantages while adding devastating firepower, but it also inherited one critical Sherman vulnerability. The long 17-pounder barrel projected far forward of the turret, making the Firefly visibly distinctive from standard Shermans. German crews and anti-tank gunners quickly learned to identify Fireflies by their long barrels and to prioritize them as threats. German tactical doctrine was modified within weeks of encountering Fireflies. Tank crews and anti-tank gun crews received explicit instructions to engage long-barreled Shermans first, before addressing standard Shermans or other Allied armour. This targeting priority reflected German recognition that Fireflies posed the only serious threat to Panthers and Tigers among British armour. Eliminating Fireflies first restored German qualitative superiority on the battlefield. British crews responded with various camouflage schemes to disguise the Firefly's distinctive appearance. The most common technique involved painting the forward half of the barrel with white countershading, reducing its visual contrast against the sky. Some crews fitted false muzzle brakes approximately halfway along the barrel, creating a visual termination point that made the gun appear shorter, similar in length to a standard 75mm Sherman gun. These camouflage measures had limited effectiveness at close range, but at distances beyond a few hundred yards, they could create enough visual confusion to delay German target identification by crucial seconds. In tank combat, those seconds could mean the difference between shooting first or being shot. Every moment of hesitation, every instant of uncertainty about which Sherman was the deadly Firefly, worked in British favour. Statistical analysis of Firefly losses compared to standard Sherman losses in Normandy revealed an interesting pattern. Despite being priority targets for German gunners, Fireflies actually suffered slightly lower loss rates than standard Shermans. Analysis from the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry showed that 19% of Fireflies were lost compared to 29% of standard Shermans during the initial weeks of the Normandy campaign. This counterintuitive result reflected tactical employment doctrine. Fireflies were positioned in hull-down firing positions supporting advances by standard Shermans rather than leading charges. Firefly commanders were instructed to engage enemy armour from concealment when possible, using the gun's superior range to full advantage. This defensive overwatch role reduced exposure while maximizing the Firefly's killing power against German heavy tanks. The importance of Caen and Montgomery's operations in pinning German armoured forces meant British and Commonwealth units faced over 70% of all German armour deployed during the Battle of Normandy. This included more than half of the elite Waffen-SS Panzer units equipped with the newest and most powerful German tanks. For British tank crews, the Firefly represented not just improved capability, but psychological confidence that they could fight Panthers and Tigers without helplessly watching their shots bounce off. On June 14, 1944, Sergeant Harris of the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards demonstrated the Firefly's capabilities in devastating fashion. Near the hamlet of Lingevre, close to Tilly-sur-Sulaz, Harris encountered 5 Panthers from the Panzer Division. The engagement began at approximately 1,000 yards, at the extreme effective range for reliable penetration of Panther frontal armor. Harris fired his first round at the lead Panther, striking it in the turret front and penetrating. The Panther stopped, smoke pouring from its hatches. Rather than remaining stationary to finish the engagement, Harris ordered his driver to reposition after each shot, moving to new firing locations between engagements. This constant movement made it difficult for the surviving Panthers to fix his location and return effective fire. Over the course of approximately 15 minutes, Harris destroyed all 5 Panthers, changing position between each shot. His tactical discipline, refusing to remain stationary even when scoring hits, exemplified proper Firefly employment doctrine. The gun's power was only effective if the tank survived to use it. Movement, concealment, and tactical positioning were as important as accurate gunnery. These early engagements established the Firefly's reputation among both Allied and German forces. British tank crews who had felt desperately outmatched by German armour now possessed a weapon that could kill Panthers reliably. The psychological impact was immense. Knowing you could fight back, that you weren't simply a target for German guns, transformed morale and tactical confidence. For German crews, the Firefly represented a disturbing new reality. Their technological superiority, the advantage that had allowed them to dominate Allied armour throughout the war, was evaporating. Panthers could be penetrated, Tigers could be destroyed. The invulnerability they had counted on was revealed as an illusion, shattered by British engineering determination and the 17-pounder's devastating power. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. August 8, 1944. Operation Totalize. The 1st Canadian Army launched a major offensive to break through German defences south of Caen and drive toward Falaise. The operation commenced with massive aerial bombardment by American heavy bombers, followed by ground assault featuring Canadian, British, and Polish armoured formations. The objective was to collapse the German defensive line and cut off retreating German forces. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, equipped with Sherman Fireflies, advanced as part of the operation. By early morning, elements of A and C squadrons had reached the French village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramsnil and moved south into the wooded area called Del de la Roque. The understrength, A Squadron, took positions along the southern portion of the woods, with 3rd Troop positioned on the western edge, overlooking open ground. From this position, they had clear observation of Route Nationale 158, the main road running south from Caen toward Falaise. The crews settled in, waiting for German reaction to the Allied offensive. They didn't have to wait long. German armoured reserves were being committed in a desperate counterattack to stem the Allied breakthrough. Trooper Joe Ekins served as gunner in Sergeant Gordon's Sherman Firefly, call sign Velikie Luki. At 21 years old, Ekins was a reluctant soldier who had volunteered for service, but later described military service as the biggest mistake of his life. He came from Rushden, Northamptonshire, where he had worked in a shoe factory before the war. His only gunnery training consisted of 5 practice rounds fired on a range just weeks before. Ekins later recalled feeling wholly unprepared for combat. The Firefly had been issued to his squadron only 6 weeks before deployment to Normandy. Most of his practical training occurred under fire during the brutal hedgerow fighting of June and July. Now, positioned in the woods overlooking open farmland, he was about to face the most formidable German armour in Normandy. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, German tanks appeared on Route Nationale 158, advancing north from the town of Sintho. From their elevated position, Ekins and his crew could see 3 Tiger tanks moving in formation, spaced approximately 100 to 200 yards apart. They were massive, intimidating machines, weighing nearly 70 tons each and armed with the feared 88mm gun. What Ekins didn't know was that 7 Tiger tanks were actually advancing in the area, along with Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns, forming a powerful counterattack force. But from 3rd Troop's position, only 3 Tigers were visible. The troop commander, observing the German formation through binoculars, made a critical tactical decision. He ordered the crews to hold fire until the Tigers were well within effective range. As the Tigers advanced closer, Ekins centered the rearmost tank in his gunner's sight. The range was approximately 800 to 1,000 yards, far enough that the Tigers appeared small through the optics, but close enough for confident hits with the 17-pounder. Ekins later described his thoughts at that moment with brutal honesty. "There's no way one tank is going to knock out 3 Tigers. You allow 5 Shermans to 1 Tiger. There's no way we're going to knock them out." The order came. "Fire!" Ekins squeezed the trigger. The 17-pounder erupted with tremendous recoil and deafening blast. Through the smoke and dust, kicked up by the muzzle blast, Ekins couldn't see the impact point. The commander, observing from his position, called corrections. "Fire again." The second shot struck the rearmost Tiger squarely. The tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The middle Tiger, seeing one of its companions destroyed, began traversing its turret toward the British position. Ekins could see the Tiger's gun swinging toward him, the 88mm barrel that could tear his Sherman apart with a single hit. The commander ordered rapid repositioning, and the driver backed the Firefly slightly, changing position just enough to throw off the Tiger's aim. The Tiger fired 2 rounds, both struck near the British position, one hitting the turret front and injuring Sergeant Gordon, who bailed out wounded. The troop officer took command, ordering Ekins to engage the Tiger that had just fired. Ekins aimed carefully, accounting for range and the Tiger's slight angle. 1 shot. The round struck the Tiger's turret and penetrated. The German tank stopped, smoke pouring from every hatch as the crew bailed out. The third Tiger, witnessing 2 of its companions destroyed in rapid succession, attempted to seek cover. But Ekins's eyes were already locked onto it. 2 more shots. The third Tiger caught fire and stopped. In approximately 12 minutes of combat, Ekins had destroyed 3 Tiger tanks with 5 rounds fired from his 17-pounder gun. The engagement didn't end there. The main German counterattack developed toward C Squadron's position shortly after. A squadron, now minus Sergeant Gordon's Firefly, moved to support. In the resulting combat, Ekins destroyed a Panzer IV before his tank was hit by return fire, and the crew was forced to bail out. But the damage was done. The German counterattack had been shattered. 5 of the 7 Tigers in the area were destroyed that day, along with numerous other German tanks. Among those Tigers was tank number 007, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann. Wittmann was one of Germany's most celebrated tank commanders, credited with 138 Allied tank kills and extensively used in Nazi propaganda. His most famous action occurred at Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, where his single Tiger ambushed elements of the British 7th Armoured Division, destroying numerous tanks and vehicles in a devastating surprise attack. Now, less than 2 months later, Wittmann advanced north along Route Nationale 158 directly into the killing zone covered by British Fireflies. The exact sequence of events remains disputed among historians. Some evidence suggests a squadron of the Canadian Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, positioned at Gaumsnil Chateau approximately 500 metres from Wittmann's line of advance, fired the fatal shots. Other evidence points to Joe Ekins firing from 800 to 1,200 metres away. What is certain is that Wittmann's Tiger was struck and destroyed, with the turret blown completely off by ammunition explosion. Photographic evidence shows the tank came to rest in a field near Gaumsnil, its turret lying upside down several yards from the hull. Whether Joe Ekins fired the specific round that killed Wittmann is less important than the larger tactical reality. Multiple Allied tanks with 17-pounder guns were engaging German Tigers successfully, destroying them at ranges where the Germans expected safety. The Battle of August 8, 1944, demonstrated conclusively that the 17-pounder had changed the armoured warfare equation fundamentally. German heavy tanks were no longer invulnerable. They could be killed, frontally, at combat ranges, by Allied tanks. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound and lasting. German after-action reports from late summer 1944 describe increasing reluctance among panzer crews to engage Allied armour aggressively. Tank commanders reported hesitancy that hadn't existed earlier in the war, a phenomenon some described as Panther paralysis. The fear wasn't just about being destroyed, it was about being destroyed unexpectedly, from angles and ranges where crews thought they were safe. This erosion of confidence had tactical consequences that rippled across the Western Front. German armour, which had previously advanced boldly using its qualitative superiority, now proceeded cautiously, aware that any Sherman might be the deadly Firefly variant. This caution slowed German counterattacks, reduced their effectiveness, and degraded the combat power of German panzer divisions beyond simple numerical losses. Production of Fireflies continued throughout summer and autumn 1944. From D-Day in June to the end of the Battle of Normandy in late August, almost 400 Sherman Fireflies were converted, more than sufficient to replace combat losses and expand the number in service. By late 1944, with improved production of high-explosive ammunition for the 17-pounder, British units began receiving 2 Fireflies per troop instead of 1, doubling the anti-tank capability of each formation. The Firefly served in every British and Commonwealth armoured regiment in northwest Europe. Canadian, Polish, New Zealand, and South African forces all employed Fireflies with similar success. The tank fought in Operation Market Garden, the disastrous airborne assault on Arnhem in September 1944. It fought during the Battle of the Bulge in December, helping blunt the final major German offensive in the west. And it fought through Germany itself in early 1945, as Allied forces drove toward Berlin. Throughout this service, the Firefly maintained its reputation as the Allied tank German crews most feared. Post-war interviews with German tank commanders consistently identified the Firefly as the most dangerous Allied armour they faced. The combination of the Sherman's reliability and the 17-pounder's killing power created a weapon system that negated German technological advantages while maintaining operational availability. The United States Army initially showed little interest in the Firefly, preferring to develop their own solutions to the German armour problem. The American 76mm gun on upgraded Shermans provided better performance than the standard 75mm, but remained inferior to the British 17-pounder. The 90mm gun on the M26 Pershing tank was superior, but Pershings didn't reach Europe in significant numbers until very late in the war. However, by March 1945, with the war clearly entering its final months, the US Army requested Sherman Firefly conversions for their own use. As many as 18 Fireflies were converted specifically for American forces, but the war in Europe ended in May 1945, before they could be shipped. Had the war continued, American tank units would have added Fireflies to their formations, acknowledging British success in mounting the most powerful Allied tank gun in a Sherman hull. Between 2100 and 2200, Sherman Fireflies were produced during the war, making it by far the most numerous vehicle mounting the 17-pounder. The Challenger tank, the purpose-built British design for the 17-pounder, saw only about 200 produced before cancellation. The M10 Achilles, a British conversion of the American M10 tank destroyer, mounting the 17-pounder, numbered approximately 1,200 conversions. The Firefly's legacy extended far beyond World War II. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, they deployed Soviet T-3485 medium tanks against poorly equipped South Korean and initial American forces. The T-3485's 85mm gun and well-sloped armour made it superior to early American reinforcements. Britain offered assistance, and among the equipment provided were Sherman Fireflies from war reserve stocks. These Fireflies, 6 years after the end of World War II, once again proved their value. The 17-pounder could penetrate T-3485 armour at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards, giving UN forces significant advantage in tank combat. The gun that had been developed to kill Panthers and Tigers now killed T-34 seconds with similar efficiency, demonstrating that good design transcends specific conflicts. Israel also employed Sherman Fireflies acquired from British war stocks. When Israel fought its War of Independence in 1948 through 49, a handful of Fireflies provided critical armoured capability against Arab forces. Even more remarkably, Israel continued using upgraded Shermans, including some Firefly variants, into the 1960s and early 70s, rearming them with modern French guns and diesel engines but retaining the basic hull and mechanical design. The 17-pounder gun itself continued in British service through the 1950s, eventually replaced by the 84mm 20-pounder gun on the Centurion tank. But the principles pioneered by the 17-pounder, particularly the use of armour-piercing discarding sabot ammunition with tungsten or depleted uranium penetrators, remain fundamental to modern tank gun design. Today's tank guns, like the British L-30 rifled gun on the Challenger 2 or the German L-55 smoothbore on the Leopard 2A7, fire armour-piercing, fin-stabilised discarding sabot rounds at velocities approaching 5,500 feet per second. These weapons can penetrate armor thicknesses that would have been inconceivable in 1944, but they are direct descendants of the technology developed to mount the 17-pounder in a Sherman turret and to create APDS ammunition capable of defeating Panther armor. The Sherman Firefly never achieved the iconic status of German Tigers or American Pershings in popular imagination. It wasn't the most advanced tank design or the most heavily armored. It was an expedient, a stopgap solution to a critical problem, created by welding together American production capability and British engineering determination. Yet, it proved more effective than purpose-built designs, more reliable than technologically sophisticated alternatives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.